Friends, hello and welcome to In the Movement. My name is Sam Heath and I work with Equal Justice USA and I'm the manager of our evangelical network, and it is great to have you all here today. So this is our In the Movement webinar. We also put it out as a podcast episode, and our hope in this time is always to engage and elevate the voices of people in the justice movement, wherever that may take us. And so we'll be focusing on some specific things today and doing, in a sense, a case study on a matter within a certain state, and then see what lessons are there that we can broaden to other states or to things national. So one thing that's important within this webinar that we always talk about is we think about and talk about mass incarceration, right? And when we talk about justice, we're thinking about the criminal legal system. And one thing we want to see and emphasize is that mass incarceration isn't just a problem to be solved. It's a symptom of something else. We as a society, we think, really rely on fear and control in response to when harm happens, rather than having a posture of healing. And especially for Christians who we're talking to within this space, it's in conflict, that obsession with fear and confinement and control, with the posture of mercy and forgiveness and restoration that we're meant to have. And I always think about the most often repeated command within the Bible is not to fear. And yet that fear piece is the cornerstone of the criminal legal system. So again, mass incarceration is a result of a misguided way that we as a nation respond to harm. And so we want to interrogate that. We want to focus on healing and highlight individuals that are pursuing that. If you think of two arrows, sometimes at EJUSA, we talk about, we want to decrease the violence of the system, the state's ability to harm. And we want to increase community safety by increasing community power. And so both pieces of that story are always really important. So Equal Justice USA, we're a national nonprofit, and we do work in the area of death penalty repeal, restorative justice, and community safety as a whole. And the Evangelical Network is a branch of EJUSA that especially reaches out to evangelical Christians, but to people of faith more broadly as well, about what justice work is happening in your community, and can we bridge that gap from justice work often to churches and groups that want to engage work like that. And so our topic today specifically is the death penalty in Florida. So we're going to be talking with two individuals who are here representing that work in the group FADP, or Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. And so I want to go and welcome our guests and give them a chance to say hello and to talk with and meet you all. But we have Agustin who is with us, and Maria de Liberato, who are going to talk about messaging and narrative and policy around death penalty and some of the unique things that are happening right now within Florida. So first, Maria, and then Agustin, if you want to just say a quick hello and who you are, and then we'll dive into things. But thanks for coming so much.
Thanks so much for having us, Sam. I'm Maria de Liberato. I am the executive director for Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, which is a statewide nonprofit dedicated to bringing about the end of the death penalty in Florida through legislative abolition. I'm also a longtime capital defense lawyer. I was a prosecutor first out of law school for a couple of years. I spent 3 years doing that, and I've spent the last 17 years doing capital defense work. I'm also a part-time assistant public defender in the 6th Judicial Circuit, and I handle pretrial death penalty cases. So I'm doing work at the trial level and abolition work at the advocacy level, and in my role as executive director of FADP.
I love this because, Maria, and we'll talk about this, I feel you get to see so many vantage points of the system, of working within it, of advocacy and organizing from outside of it to affect it. So I'm really thankful for your many roles. So thank you. All right, Agustin, welcome, friend.
Thank you, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here. Well, my name is Agustin, and I lead an organization called Mission Talk, which focuses on helping Latino evangelicals engage on some of the justice issues that are not predominantly spoken about in our community. And in the past 2 years, we've been engaging heavily on the death penalty, working together with Maria and some of your national partners.
Well, I'm thrilled that both of you are here and for your roles and your experiences and all that you're bringing to this. A couple things to situate us before we dive into things. I always want to think of the system as a whole and then zero in on what we're talking about. And one statistic that it's worth repeating every time is to think about the size of the system. By that, I mean the criminal legal system in the US. So the US has about 5% of the world's population, but about 20% of the world's prisoners. So our prison population currently is just under 2 million. It peaked out a few years ago at about 2.2. But if we add in those that are on probation or parole, it's an additional 3.7 million people. And so when we're talking about the system, it is this massive, almost 6 million affecting person system of people at varying stages of engaging it. And that's just people currently engaging it right now, right? There's those individuals who throughout the course of their life have or will in the future engage it. If we're talking about the death penalty specifically globally, about 70% of the nations across the world have repealed the death penalty. And within the United States, we've got 23 states plus DC that have repealed the death penalty. So 27 states are remaining that practice the death penalty, but there are only about 5 states, Florida among them, that are currently and actively doing executions. There's about 2,500 people on death row within the United States and about 193 exonerations that have happened in the modern era of the death penalty since the 1970s, including one that was really, really recent. So some things about Florida. I'll save most of that, but I did want to make sure that we mention this. Florida has the second largest death row and I believe the most recent execution. And I think we'll make sure to talk about that. But Florida's gone through a lot recently, not just with the death penalty. I mean, there was the hurricane. Ron DeSantis, your governor, is running for president. There's the tragedy in Jacksonville. And I'll mention one exciting thing. Agustin, I know you and your family welcomed a pretty recent baby. And how long ago was it? Because let's name a hopeful point too.
That's a 9 months ago.
Okay. Okay, that's still recent. That's still a newborn. Y'all are still in it. Well, I'm so excited about that. So there's a lot that's happening in Florida. And let's start here. Maria, you name some of these things about FADP or Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty, about what they do. And let me read this, and then I'd love for you to give us what's a state of the death penalty in Florida, kind of what's going on, where are things headed, what's happening. But I know FADP talks about on its site that, you said this a bit too, it's a Florida-based statewide organization of individuals and groups working together to end the death penalty in Florida. And y'all's work includes dozens of state and local groups, thousands of individual Floridians, including murder victim family members, other survivors of violent crime, law enforcement professionals, families of the incarcerated, and death row exonerations, which are a whole host of people affected by this. That's another theme that I think we really want to emphasize, are just the concentric circle of effects of something like this within a space. So first, Maria, what's happening with the death penalty in Florida, and give us a better sense of what's happening on the ground.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, obviously, Florida has the second largest death row population in the country. We also have the highest number of death row exonerations. Of that 193, Florida is responsible for 30 of them. We've had over 100 executions. And I think what's the best place to start is, since January of this year, so much has changed. We had a 4-year period where we did not have any executions. We enjoyed unanimity, the requirement of jury unanimity, which is normal in every other state. For a very long time, Florida was one of the very few states that didn't require jury unanimity. In 2016, the United States Supreme Court said, nope, the jury has to be unanimous in a death penalty case, just like every other state. So we passed unanimity. And then what happened this year, starting in January, which really takes us back to October, if I'm being honest, we had the Parkland trial, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The school shooting in Parkland was a death penalty trial that happened in October, and 3, potentially 4, depending on the jurors that you talk to, members of that jury voted that the Parkland shooter should receive life in prison. They actually found that the aggravators did not outweigh the mitigation, meaning the mitigating factors that he presented were so severe and sufficient that they did not warrant the death penalty. And that brought outrage. I mean, there's no other way to say it. And it's understandable. It was a horrific tragedy, and it brought outrage and backlash. And that coincided with sort of this perfect storm of Governor DeSantis wanting to run for president on this kind of law and order style platform that he felt would be sufficient and helpful to get him the Republican nomination. And I'm not saying anything that's untrue, right? These are words from his mouth, what he wanted to do. And so they took the Parkland verdict and they ran with it to try to say, we've got to fix this problem. And it wasn't really a problem, but they used one case And so they convinced the legislature, which, once Governor DeSantis made that a priority, the legislature early on in January decided there was 2 bills filed in the House, one in the House and one in the Senate, to remove the unanimity requirement and reduce it to only 8 jurors. So because the Parkland vote was 9-3, they didn't want to go to 10-2. They wanted to try to fix that. So they went 8-4, which is almost identical to the statute previously that had been declared unconstitutional. So that's the one thing that happened in January. The second thing that happened in January, very tied together politically. So on the same day, the governor announced his intent to make the legislature change the law back to 8 jurors. He signed the first death warrant in 4 years for Mr. Dilbeck, who had a jury vote, incidentally, of 8-4. And so that was going to be Florida's first execution since 2019. And unfortunately, what we've seen since then is he has not stopped. He's set an execution about every 6-ish weeks. We are approaching our 6th execution on October 3rd of Mr. Michael Zach, and we'll have more conversation about that and specific actions you can take in support of Mr. Zach. But Florida is a very dark place for the death penalty. We are the most extreme death penalty state in the nation now, and we are executing the most, and we are making it easier to sentence people to death. And so I took over at FADP about a year ago, a little over a year now, and I sort of joke that, I became the head of an abolitionist organization, and now we have the worst death penalty statute in the country and executions again. So clearly I'm doing swimmingly. But the reality is the backlash from Parkland brought this in, and it's a pendulum. And what I'm excited is the wrong word because it's really hard, but this is now the forefront. Florida is the center of this. We are in the trenches here fighting, and this is the time to make a difference. And I believe we're doing so. I mean, the conversations that we're having, we're getting a ton of support in opposition of these executions. There was a lot of conversation in the legislature about why we shouldn't change the law. And so people are talking about it now. And so I'm grateful for the awareness of what's happening, but Florida I'm happy I'm not happy to say it, but I've ventured to say that Florida is the most extreme death penalty state in the nation right now.
Which is saying a lot, right? Considering how things have gone in some of the other states. Let me also pause here and say to those listening a reminder, we'll save the last 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. So anything that comes up from what Maria or Agustin share, you're welcome to type a question in the chat or to put it in the Q&A, and we'll make sure to come back to as many of those as we're able to by the end. But just to be really, really clear, because this is something that's pretty unique to Florida, you're talking about the jury unanimity. I mean, the vast majority of death penalty states, it has to be a unanimous jury, usually 12 individuals who all decide for that sentence to occur to someone. But yet Florida, for a season, that was there, then gone, then back, but no longer requires that unanimity, and that it only now the requirement is that 8 jurors vote in favor of the death penalty, which means it is not a unanimous vote within a jury deliberation room for that to happen. And that's exceptional, which again, I think is part of what you're saying of Florida being exceptional in the negative sense of the word, which again is a lot to consider, right? You've got states like Oklahoma that scheduled out 25 executions. They've spread those out over about 60 days or so, but there's a lot of delay and a lot of executions that just haven't happened. But to your point, Florida's on its way to its 6th one. So I know that Ron Wright is one exoneree who does work with you all within Florida. And he was on In the Movement a few months ago. And that was a great conversation that we'll make sure to send out to people if you didn't see it. I believe he was the 27th of 30 exonerations. And can you say a little more about that? 30 is a lot. I know it's the highest for any state, but by a good bit, right?
Yeah, and so it's interesting, and also Ron Wright is on our board, and so is Clemente Aguirre, who's another one of Florida's exonerees, who is my client. I represented Mr. Aguirre for 10 years and was joyful to get to bring him home in 2018. But it's interestingly also tied to the unanimity piece. So 93% of those 30 exonerations involve non-unanimous juries, and so Herman Lindsay is also an exoneree who's also on our board. So we have 3 exonerees on FADP's board. Herman is our vice chair. He and Clemente had non-unanimous jury votes, and I believe Mr. Wright did as well. And so what's interesting is the the unreliability of the death penalty and what happens in, I think, in an exoneration case is when you have to death qualify a jury, there's a whole process, right? Before you even go to trial, the jury has to answer questions about whether they could impose the death penalty before they've even heard if the person is guilty or innocent. It's just the way the system works. It's super broken, but that's what happens. And so a jury who is, we call them death qualified, is oftentimes a little more predisposed to convicting because they tend to believe in the death penalty. If you're against the death penalty, you're not allowed to serve on a jury. That's if you cannot impose the death penalty, you cannot be a juror. And so what happens is these jurors get selected, and then the guilt the guilt phase happens. There's oftentimes, deliberation, long deliberations, things like that. Then they get to penalty and they're like, well, we're pretty sure he did it, but we're not so sure. So we've split on the death penalty. And so that is another danger of why we've gone back to non-unanimity now. We are going to see more and more exonerations because people will be convicted. And before, maybe under unanimity, they would get a life sentence because if they couldn't get unanimous, it would be a life sentence. And now we'll see more death sentences of innocent people. And it's just shameful. So there's a direct correlation between exonerations and non-unanimity. And Florida, I think that is the reason our number is so high, is because we sentence so many more people to death because of non-unanimity.
Are there other states in the nation that have non-unanimity within their jury processes?
So Alabama is the only other one. They require 10 jury votes. They actually introduced a bill to go to unanimity this session. I'm pretty sure it died. It didn't go anywhere. But Alabama is the only other state that allows non-unanimous. There's another state that does sort of judge-only sentencing if the jury can't agree. So like if the jury cannot unanimously reach a decision, then the judge decides. So it's a little bit of a hybrid system. But as far as for states that let the jury make a determination of the death penalty, only Alabama is non-unanimous, and that's 10 jurors, not 8.
Okay. Also know within Alabama, until very recently, it allowed judicial override. So a judge could overrule what a jury had wanted regarding a death sentence. And thankfully that has since been outlawed, but yet it's not retroactive. So I think about 30 individuals on Alabama's death row sit there when a jury voted for them to likely receive life without parole, but yet a judge overrode that. So just some context of things within other states. And Maria, how many are on death row right now within Florida?
I haven't looked at the number, but just under 300. We're usually kind of just hovering right under 300 to 290, somewhere around there. But yeah, and about of those, about 100 to 150 are warrant eligible, meaning they've gone through all the appeals process and are at risk of an execution date any day. And Florida is different. I don't want to say whether it's better or worse because I can't imagine the horror of being in this situation like in Oklahoma where your date of death is so far out. That's horrifying. But in Florida, it is completely random and solely on the whim of the governor. So in our if some of you subscribe to our emails, but in our last email, I talked about that a little bit. The way it happens is the warden just sort of comes down to death row and stands in front of the cell and reads the death warrant. And there's no warning, right? And so the guys on the row, they call them the white shirts, because that's the color that the more senior guards wear, they come down the hall all the time. They're in a constant state of stress that they might be next.
Wow.
It's horrifying. And so there's about 150 in that posture because some of them who've just arrived, there's a whole process. So you cannot get to the place where the governor could sign your warrant until you make it through the court process once. And then there's a certification that basically says you're eligible for clemency. And then clemency, unlike other states, so Florida doesn't somebody has a clemency hearing and they don't get an answer. There's no answer. They have a clemency hearing, and then the way they learn that their clemency was denied is when their warrant is signed. So we always ask the governor to reopen the clemency process and grant clemency, which is what we're asking for Michael Zach. And we have a petition that I know Bridget's on in the chat and can share it, and Sam will share it after. But that's the ask. But it's not like there's already been the decision to deny his clemency is made with the signing of the warrant, which is totally at the discretion of the governor and could come at any time. And typically in Florida, the execution space is about 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks from the date of the signing to the date of execution.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. You mentioned in comparison with states like Oklahoma, and we said before that they scheduled earlier this year a bulk of executions of 25, or late last year of 25 over the next while. And then there's Ohio that has scheduled executions the furthest of any state out through 2026. But yet Florida has had the most this year, coming up on 6 executions there. But just 5 states of Oklahoma, Ohio, Missouri, Texas, and Florida are really actively executing, particularly this year. And then, Maria, the size of death row, you said that within Florida. After California, is it the second highest? In California, 600 or so.
Yep.
Okay.
And Florida's hovers around 3. We were before Hearst, before the United States Supreme Court said unanimity was required. That led to a lot of resentencings and a lot of people getting life. So we were at 400 then. So over since 2016, we've actually reduced the population by about 100 because of the Hearst resentencings that either went back and people got life, or the state attorneys in those cases. I had several of those where they decided not to seek. So we did that, again, because we had non-unanimity for so long. When we went to unanimity, some of that was made retroactive. And so about 100 people were able to get off death row during that time.
Okay. Wow. All right. Agustin, I want to hear from you on this. When you talk with people in your community and the outreach and organizing that you do, what is it you talk about that you're wanting to achieve? Right? Because I want people to think about, when we're talking about the death penalty, there's different levels of things. You might be talking about repeal of death penalty for the state. You might be talking about a moratorium. You might be talking about clemency for an individual, or stopping an individual execution. So what does it look like when you talk with the communities you engage, of what it is that you're wanting people to do and what you're asking them? Oh, and you're on mute. It's all right. That's all right.
Sorry about that.
There we go.
When I got exposed to the death penalty, in that it was through Ingrid Delgado and Celeste Fitzgerald, are very good friends of ours,
who just moved to Charlottesville, where I am right now.
Yeah,
by the way, she just emailed me. She's settled in.
Yeah, she's a great friend, and she really took her time to really educate us.
Mm.
And when I heard just the atrocities and those numbers and those experiences that Maria was just sharing, and Maria, I don't know I'm not sure you've heard Clemente Aguirre's testimony sometimes, where they even walk, those that are going to be executed, right before dead men walking, and just create that fear in them. So when I heard of those experiences and having some of the other leaders come and speak to us, I know that this topic is very, very close to the heart of Latino evangelicals, because our community, for the most part, when it comes to life, they lean conservative in that area, and life is very, the concept of life is very, very precious to them, right? And one of the things that we do here is just engage them in conversations, right? Engage them in conversations, and a lot of my community, Latino evangelical community, for the most part, have very little knowledge on the process of the death penalty, how the death penalty works, and just information on the death penalty. That's some of the gaps that we're trying to cover. And think about, we are 1.2 million Latino evangelicals in Florida. I mean, just imagine what we can do, right? If we are able to educate and get some of these key leaders who lead this community to embrace, right? And talk to them about the concept of redemption and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And you could see how during the last 2 years we mobilized, around between 250, 300 pastors and lay leaders to Tallahassee to advocate, right, against the death penalty and other issues. But the death penalty was a central piece to our advocacy work. So there's definitely an interest in the topic once we educate it. The biggest problem that we have is, that the leaders, political leaders that engage our community on some of the issues, selective issues, do not address, just focus on probably 2 issues that really interest them, but they don't really address some of the other issues that has to do, with life values. So our community is always absent from that education. We're trying to fill that gap through the partnership with Florida for Alternative to the Death Penalty and with the 8th Amendment Project with Equal Justice USA. But it's a slow process. It's a slow process. But once they get it, and once the few that we've been able to engage, once they get it, they take action, and they want to learn more.
What are some ways that you talk about why this is especially important for Latino evangelicals, or what's uniquely important about it to speak about and to rally those communities?
I think something that resonates with them is when you explain to them that the majority of these people that are on the death row, are poor, right? They don't have the right representation, and they don't have the right probably funding and financial means to really fight a good defense. When you speak to them from them being vulnerable on that end, it resonates with them, because they really, most of their ministries, what they do is to really engage in impoverished communities, right? So they have a heart for the
Mm-hmm.
poor. They have a heart for the homeless, right? And a lot of these people that are on death row, inmates that are in death row, a lot of them come from that background, no means, and that really, that really resonates with them and really moves them.
Had a very odd and hard conversation with my daughter yesterday. She's in third grade, where she was asking some questions about the death penalty, and she knows maybe more than she should about the work that I do. And we had those conversations within our home, and we were talking about who it is that's on death row and who it is often that ends up being executed. And I at one point had to say to her, unfortunately, often if you have money and often if you are white, those are not the individuals that are regularly being executed. So pointing out that piece of those that are impoverished, or most often those that are on death row or affected, is huge. And especially for Christians, for any human, but especially within Christianity, that has this call to not sideline the poor, but yet to engage them and love them and welcome them. It's such an overturned flip-flop process when we look at who it is that is on death row. Maria, can you talk about what do Floridians think about the death penalty kind of on the ground? And has that changed over time, whether that's just anecdotal and or polling? Kind of what do people think about that in public opinion within Florida?
Yeah, so it's interesting, having done this work for so long from the litigation standpoint and talking to hundreds and hundreds of jurors to now from the, abolition standpoint, Floridians are no different than any other state. The death penalty nationwide and in Florida is, it's 50-50-ish. It's typically, if you ask a juror, life without the possibility of parole versus the death penalty, it's slightly higher for life without the possibility of parole, more like 60-40. But when you see it, when you're sort of the anecdotal pieces, you're seeing it in the jury vote, right? Like the Parkland case is a perfect example, like 9-3. That's like about 60% and 30%, right? Like 66 and 33, however you want to do it. Math is not my strong suit. That's why I went to law school. But so I think, it's not that Floridians favor the death penalty or want the death penalty more so than other states. I think they very much either are uneducated about it, are unaware that Florida is such an active death penalty state. We're seeing that a lot. And that is one of FADP's major goals and roles, especially in the upcoming year, is to just continue to increase awareness and education. And, unfortunately, our governor is doing that for us by these executions. And that's why we must and we will continue to keep speaking out and keep telling the truth about the people that are being executed. I mean, you mentioned your conversation with your daughter, right? That's the people that are on death row are the most broken, the most vulnerable, the most victimized. And that's how they got there. You don't get on death row because you had a happy, safe, loving, well-adjusted, financially secure childhood. You just don't. I mean, anybody who does this work for 5 minutes can tell you that. And so I think that getting Floridians to understand who we're executing and who we're sentencing to death will swing that pendulum even further the other way, because they're already at a tipping point. It's already just people don't believe in the death penalty for a bunch of reasons. And the ones that do believe in it, they're like, well, I think we should have it on the books, or it's a deterrent, or some people are so evil, or, they're thinking about, Charlie Manson, or, the Silence of the Lambs guy, right? Like that's what they think.
Right.
I think that's who's on death row. And that's just not reality. So it's getting that education piece that's really, really critically important. But as far as polling, Floridians are no different than any other state. Our lawmakers want you to believe otherwise, but that was a political opportunity that they took based on a knee-jerk response to a very tragic situation.
Yeah, when we think about who it is that is on death row and you look at these cases, you're right. You look at their history and it is a litany of abuse and trauma, without exception, which does not excuse anything that has been done, but yet explains so much. To your point, these are not individuals who had a happy, well-adjusted childhood that was largely filled with love. I also think about the case that you talked about, the idea of a deterrent, and I just have to throw this in because it's such a importantly refutable statement, right? We're talking less than 1% of individuals who are prosecuted for murder that actually make it to death row and get executed. So if we want this to be a deterrent, the chances of somebody who has murdered someone being executed are incredibly small. And so if we're just looking at it from the numbers. Well, Agustin, talk to us about how did you get into this kind of work, specifically wanting to engage Latino evangelicals around the death penalty? And then, Maria, I'd love to hear your path too. And I'm sure part of that includes some of your work within the system as a lawyer. But Agustin, what got you here to do this work? Don't forget to come off mute.
As I mentioned before, I had a conversation with Celeste Fitzgerald, who ended the death penalty in New Jersey. She has been a mentor and walking me through some of these, understanding the death penalty, and of course with Ingrid Delgado, who used to work for the Conference of Catholic Conference of the for the Florida Conference of Catholic Bishops, and it's been a journey with them, and then I became part of the board of the Florida for Alternative to the Death Penalty, and that has helped me engaging with some of the exonerations and some of the great leaders that the board has, which really help me educate myself even more. I think, if we can, if I can say, the way I see this playing out in my community, we need some church-based structure where the church, they make the death penalty part of the education of the church. They made the death penalty part of the vision of the church, right? And some of the justice issues make them part of the church, and like that, the church can educate. Sadly, a lot of times our communities are just informed by media, right? Aside, not from the pulpit. And I think that's a way forward. So me personally, getting educated by some of the leaders in the movement, but I believe that our step forward to engage a lot of other church leaders and other pastors would be to find a way to make intentional times within church spaces to educate our community on this, because there's a great majority. I mean, I talk to them, Sam, very often, and it takes seconds for them to understand and say, "Hey, I don't agree with the death penalty." So,
Right.
so there's a lot of, and then I think legislators should know that too, right? That there's a great support to end the death penalty within their community, especially with communities that they, some of these legislators really can, always gravitate to. That the same communities that they're reaching out to, that they need for their re-elections on, these communities are in support of ending the death penalty, right? So they don't have to ride on that wave of being tough, on law and order, and because it really is not the message, and it's not the environment in our communities. It is changing, and pastors and leaders and lay leaders think very different. They want to end the death penalty.
You talked about conversations with people, and so often I'll have conversations with people about the death penalty that end with them saying, this is the longest conversation I've had about the death penalty. And I think it's something that people just assume either is not happening, or like in my state, Virginia, I regularly tell people that we've repealed and they didn't know that we're not practicing the death penalty. So much of this is, I think, not something that's in individuals' minds, one. And two, I think a lot of times conversations reveal people don't see how connected this is with so many other parts and pieces of the criminal legal system as a whole. They think of it just being an issue or a single issue thing. And yet it's so revealing about the system as a whole and how we respond to harm as a whole. But Maria, for you, welcome back.
Oh yeah, I don't know what happened. My
That's all right.
just stopped working, so here I am on a different computer, same place.
Just glad you're here. So what brought you to a place of wanting to do this kind of work? And maybe it's a different answer of the legal piece and then your work as an organizer leading FADP.
Yeah, it's probably a little bit of a different question. So the death penalty for me, I was raised Catholic. My family, everybody in my family has always been against the death penalty from a moral and religious perspective. So that was kind of a sort of a baseline for me. I worked as a prosecutor while I was in law school and then in Miami. And when I was interviewed in Miami at the state attorney's office, they asked me if I believed in the death penalty. And I was like, I really don't. And they said, which I thought was fascinating and unique, was that you will never have to seek the death penalty in this office if you don't want to, and it won't impair or affect like your ability for movement. We have plenty of prosecutors who believe in it and want to seek it, and plenty that don't, and you won't be treated any differently. And I was like, well, that's, I understand it's the law in Florida and I can disagree with it, but I personally wouldn't prosecute someone in a death penalty case. And they were fine with that. And so it gave me the opportunity to sort of witness it from the prosecution standpoint and get to talk to prosecutors and understand, why they could or what they felt. And it was just sort of interesting. I was always interested in that. For me, it was just something that I never believed in. And then an opportunity came. I was moving from Miami to Tampa to work for an organization called CCRC, which is called Capital Collateral Regional Council. Florida does so many things wrong with the death penalty, but the one thing they do right is they appoint counsel for everybody who's been sentenced to death. So you have a lawyer in Florida from your arrest through execution or release. That is not true in other states. There's a state agency that appoints counsel. So I worked for that state agency for 13 years, which is how I met Clemente and how I got Clemente's case assigned to me. And so I started doing that work, and I kind of came to the job because I was interested in the death penalty. I was against it, and I really liked the appellate kind of side of things, but I sort of fell into the job. I needed a job. I was moving to Tampa, and I went to death row within 5 days of my job. When I started, I was 27 or something, 28. And I had no idea what to expect. I was like, is it going to be like Silence of the Lambs? Like, I really, truly did not know. I'd never been to a prison before. And I met all of my clients at the time. There were about 13 of them. And I left, and I was like, my colleague, who's a dear friend of mine now, we worked together for a long time. She was also one of Clemente's lawyers. She was like, what do you think? And I was like, I'm so sad. Like, they're so sad and sort of so broken and also so human. And they're not like, on paper of whatever crime that they're either committed or have alleged to have committed, like there's so much more than that. And I was like, this is what I'm supposed to do. I mean, I started on Monday, we went to death row on Friday, and I was like, this is what I'm supposed to do. And then I got a lot of joy and heartache, candidly, doing this work for so long. We had our first client executed in 2013. We lost Larry Mann, which was devastating. And of course, then Clemente's exoneration. And so I did that work for so long from the litigation standpoint. And I feel like, I was able to do good in the legal world, right? Some wins, some losses. But what happened to me and how I came to be at FADP, I was actually arguing before the Florida Supreme Court, and the Florida Supreme Court, of course, has changed composition since DeSantis has been elected. We lost 3 justices to mandatory retirement, and DeSantis has shaped the entire court. The court is his, but for 1 justice. And it's definitely shifted way against not just death penalty litigants, but criminal litigants in general. The criminal justice system in Florida it's horrendous. And the Florida Supreme Court is eliminating so many protections for the poor and the vulnerable and people of color. And it's horrifying. And so I was arguing before the Florida Supreme Court on a case about whether people who are mentally ill should be allowed to represent themselves in a death penalty case, not at trial, but in a post-conviction standpoint. And it's such an absurd proposition. I mean, everybody, even like the Attorney General, the Florida Department of Corrections, like everybody was like, this is a bad idea. Don't change the law. Don't let them represent themselves. And the court was just like sort of mocking it. And one of the justices used air quotes, like it was on Zoom because it was during the pandemic or towards the end of the pandemic. And he's like something about defendant's process. And he caught himself, right? And I was like, you're on Zoom. Do you see like what? And he caught himself and he kind of put his hands down. And I hung up that argument and I was like, this is not the answer. Like, we've got to make a change. And at the same time, Mark Elliott was retiring from FADP. And I was like, I had been working with Celeste, who Agustin mentioned, and, sort of from a consulting role. And I was like, I think I'm supposed to do this. And everybody thought I was kind of crazy. And I was part-time here, still at the public defender's office and in private practice with my dear friend. and I couldn't do all 3 jobs. So I had to get rid of one. And so I ended up leaving the private practice of law, which was an incredibly difficult decision, and taking over at FADP, because I was like, I have the knowledge and the skill set of what's actually happening on the ground, and I'm never going to fix this in the court. I think that was the realization after the oral argument, is we can't fix this in the courts. It's too late. It's too late to fix it in the court, especially in Florida, but we can fix it on the ground with Floridians, with the support of Agustin and his people, and people who are, that subscribe to EJUSA and all of that. We can get our voices loud enough to take to our legislature to make a difference. And that's how it's going to change. So for me, that's the piece from, and I'm happy that I still get to wear my litigation hat, because it does keep me connected to what's happening on the ground. So I think it's really important that I get to do both. But that's really how I got here, to be able to do this part.
Okay. What is, Agustin, you jumping in?
Yeah, sorry. A lot of
No, you're
a
good.
lot of people think, sometimes they leave it up to an organization, Equal Justice USA, for Florida Protections for Death Penalty, and it's like someone is gonna do this job. Someone is actually doing it, right? But it really doesn't happen unless each individual person from the state of Florida and nationwide who cares about this issue say, you know what can I do to make a difference? What can I do to bring about the change that's needed? Because if we don't do it, Sam, people will die. If individuals who are listening to us here, or will listen to this podcast, to this webinar, if they don't take an action themselves to end the death penalty, people will die. And innocent, poor people will die. So, I for me, and this is the message I tell my community, right? It's like, we have to do something. Everyone can do something. And as everyone has a mentality to do something, I think we can create a bigger movement to actually change. And believe, and really give ourselves permission to believe that the death penalty can come to an end.
I want to ask a question that's zooming into Florida and see what applies to other states. So I'm wondering, Maria, what does advocacy look like that's unique to Florida around the death penalty? And then where I want to go after that is, what is transferable to other states as well? Because people are watching from lots of different states all across the country, some with the death penalty, some without. But first, within Florida, what is unique about what you all are advocating for to Florida and its death penalty or death row or its process?
It's a great question. I think that because of the way that Florida does the execution process, there can be a lot of direct advocacy to the governor, right, to stop doing this. There can be constituent advocacy to say, we are Floridians and we understand that, like, there's a death penalty. We don't believe in it. We don't want there to be executions. You should take a pause. There's plenty of reasons to pause executions in Florida. We have so many problems. So we can do direct advocacy because it is a sole function of the governor to set or not set an execution. Governor DeSantis decides who lives and dies on Florida's death row. No, without question. There's no other, nobody. So we can do direct advocacy that way. Also, I think Florida is a huge state, and it's such a diverse state that what we're trying to do, and we're able to do so, we'll be hiring an organizer here soon. So more details coming on that. We're very excited about that, because we need to get better organized. We have 2 full-time staff at FADP, myself and Bridget, and then a lot of amazing volunteers on our board, like Agustin, but we are only 2 people. And so we need to, having an organizer on board will help to unite all the parts of Florida. And I think it's unique to Florida, and maybe not to other states, but Florida has a huge transplant population. A lot of people move to Florida from other states. And so it's a wide range of people who come at opposition to the death penalty for different reasons. And some come from a deeply religious faith that life is sacred from conception to natural death. There's plenty of Floridians in that voice. There's also plenty of Floridians who believe that the death penalty disproportionately targets minorities and people of color. And so there's a lot of support there. And then there's, that Florida is kind of a purpley state, right? There's pockets where it's deeply, deeply conservative. There's pockets where it's deeply liberal, and there's a lot of common ground in between. And so I think a challenge in Florida that we are trying hard to meet at FADP, and I think we'll continue to do so, especially when we get an organizer, is getting a more unified front across the state, because we are so large, not just geographically, but from a diverse population standpoint.
Hmm. I really appreciate what you're talking about with how important engaging the governor is, and the amount of power that Governor DeSantis has within Florida really is exceptional compared to other states that have processes and boards of pardon and parole and clemency restrictions all around the governor, but yet very much, and it is unique within Florida, that situation. And if we're thinking about transferring some of this to other states, nearly all of the 27 states that still have the death penalty, most of them have a state organization like FADP that is doing that work. And I'll send out to everybody who's listening and who registered that list of all of those, so you can find your state and engage some of that. But Agustin, this question for you, and then we'll talk about some of the questions that came up in the Q&A and in the chat. What unique role do you want Latino evangelicals to play within this, the fight to repeal and to end the death penalty?
Yeah, well, I think that first, before I answer that question, it's really understanding what are the challenges for not only for Latino evangelicals but also for the white evangelical community that can really make a big change or even end the death penalty. They come together, right? Part of the problem that we have in our community, and the reason why I'm going there first, then to give you the solution of what I think can be the best practice for us to end the death penalty. Part of the problem that we have in our community is that the Bible education that we get sometimes from Bible schools, the common person in our pews are not in seminary, right? Where you get a more balanced education. They usually end up at some Bible schools, either that put together by their church or their council. Sometimes it's called Bible Institutes, right? And those type of education, Bible education that they get, theological education, do not address some of the justice issues like criminal justice issues. So you have tons of pastors and leaders, going out when they graduate the schools, Bible schools, and so on, going to really launch churches in communities with beautiful, heartfelt communities to just, serve the community with zero notion of justice, work, right? Or justice, awareness of justice. Second part of the problem that we have, a lot of organizations that can help us, just FADP in this case, and right, and that in Florida that can help us educate our community when it comes to the death penalty. But FADP, we have, we have millions of Floridians. FADP cannot do the work on its own. So a lot of the organizations, right, that and I admire what FADP is doing because they're really engaging our community, engaging me and our community. Hey, we want to partner. How is it that we can convey this message in a way that your community understands? And that has been great. Equal Justice USA does the same thing. But part of it, a lot of times, some of the justice organizations that can create a more comprehensive understanding around justice issues, they lack the language of the church, right? They lack the language of the evangelical community. They try to penetrate. There's a roadblock there, and so we're left without the theological education center around justice. We're left without the justice education. And a lot of times also funding, is not there, right? So the funding does not come through so that we can help and support like FADP, support the work that Mission Talk does, that Equal Justice USA does, right? So we can enhance the work. It comes down to funding because we need boots on the ground, and to put boots on the ground, we have to really support it. So I encourage any funders that is listening to this conversation and individuals, right? Say, what, we can do something about this, and say, hey, how can we, really support this work? Because we need everyone's not only commitment personally, but also, commitment financially, so we can expand this work. So what we are doing, we're launching right now a justice leadership development program that is really focused and centered around helping the church create a sustainable ministry, justice-oriented ministry that can help the church really engage in these conversations. And when it comes to the theological education that's needed, when it comes to the research and engagement that's needed, in the community, and when it comes to really organizing and leading the communities for change and leading these issues for change, and also understanding how public policy works. A lot of the community that we have, a lot of members of our community don't even understand how a bill turns into law, something as simple as that, right? So it's like taking them from baby steps, and helping them grow little by little. And of course, last, it's really communication, how we communicate, right? And the message, how do we, as a church, really send the message out, not only on social media campaigns, and media, writing letters to the governors, helping the churches to go do all those basic stuff, and not only just Agustin or Maria to get these things out, but everybody coming together, doing their own effort to really systematically do their part in order, right? And align with the whole vision to end the death penalty. So that's kind of where we at right now. Make a difference in this space.
I think that's really important. And I think it's true in other places, spaces, and states that of left to people's own devices, our culture educates a certain thing about the death penalty, that it's necessary, that it works, and that we've got to have it to be protected. And so to any other narrative outside of that, you have to work for. You have to engage those individuals and bring them on kind of that step-by-step process to walk through it, because the public education about the death penalty, often just the default in our culture, is a single narrative. And so that engagement and making it intentional and clear is really key, that narrative shifting work. Maria, a couple of specific questions that came up in the Q&A. One is the non-unanimity law on appeal?
Yes, I mean, in various stages, actually. I mean, before I came to join this, I was upstairs in court arguing that the non-unanimity is unconstitutional. So it'll take years to wind its way through the court, quite frankly. And that's part of the reason we, tried to advocate against it, because it's going to lead to, it has already and will continue to lead to chaos and uncertainty. So it is being litigated, and it will be for decades to come.
Okay. Wow. Okay. And then talking about SMI, or severe mental illness, let's talk about that for a bit, about the number of people with severe mental illness that are executed, the advocacy around that, the laws around that. Just what does that landscape look like as we consider mental illness and the death penalty in Florida?
Yeah, I mean, Florida has a shameful history of executing the mentally ill. And I know I saw Alan Johnson in the chat, who's written some amazing pieces for us that we've shared on our website and will continue to share. We have a booklet put together as well that will be coming out of the people that Florida has executed who are seriously mentally ill. And it's continuing. These executions, almost every single one of these men had trauma, abuse, neglect, and mental illness. Mr. Owen in particular was severely mentally ill, suffered from schizophrenia, delusions up until the time of his execution. And the state of Florida executed a deeply mentally ill, incompetent man. Shameful. And so that is happening. It's happening in our names every single day. And there is no protection in Florida for a blanket protection for the seriously mentally ill. We did introduce legislation last year. We got a sponsor in the Senate. Obviously, the climate in the legislature is so hostile in light of Parkland that there's no realistic chance of passing SMI at this moment. However, that doesn't mean we don't stop advocating for it. We have a working group, an SMI working group. Bridget is attending the NAMI Florida conference in Orlando in a couple of weeks, and we have a booth there. We're a sponsor, and we continue to advocate, and it is part of our larger plan to continue to advocate to ban the execution of the seriously mentally ill. It's sort of part of our reform to repeal campaign. The problem is the climate is so hostile right now. So where we are is what we are doing and will continue to do with the assistance of people like Alan and everyone else who's helping us highlight the stories, tell the truth, shine a light on this darkness that's happening. So we will continue to do that. And Florida unfortunately has a high population of severely mentally ill people on death row. I've represented many of them over the years. And so certainly that is something that we will continue to keep in the forefront of our mind because they are lacking in protection.
Maria, really briefly, and know what you mentioned, we can put in the email to people. What can Floridians do to help with this? And what can people outside of Florida do to help Florida? In a separate category, those that have the death penalty in their states, we'll send you a list connecting you to your state DP org. But what can Floridians do and those of us outside the state to help Florida?
is a great question, and that we get that question a lot. And in both in and out of Florida, the answer is the same. So if you're in Florida, you can actually contact your legislator directly, right? You are a constituent. You should know who they are. You should know your senator. You should know your representative. We can help you find all that information. We have a tool on our website, and you should contact them. And you should tell them to support abolition. You should tell them to support reform. We want you to do that. We want you to subscribe to our newsletter, to donate if you can, to share our donation piece to other people who you know can. Because like Agustin said, funding is required to do the things that we want to do. But outside of Florida, I get this question a lot. You can help too. You can sign our petitions, and you should. Because here's the thing. Governor DeSantis is not just running for governor of Florida. He is trying to be president of the United States of America. He cares, whether he wants to or not, what people in other states think and whether he's electable or not, and whether what he's doing in Florida is something they want him to do or not do to the rest of this country. And so in Florida, if you're not in Florida, we still urge you to take our actions. It matters. The volume of voices matter. And in fact, I think it's more powerful for Governor DeSantis, who has these broader ambitions. Because look, let's be realistic. If this doesn't work out for him and he doesn't get the nomination, he's not going to stop. Like he's seeking a national position, and that's going to keep happening. So having the national opinion from states, especially all states, but especially states who are, swing states, right? Ohio, Pennsylvania, states that he knows that he needs to win in order to capture the nomination or ultimately the presidency. Your voice matters there.
Yeah.
And the quantum of voices matters everywhere. So we encourage everybody, whether you're inside of Florida, outside of Florida, and even internationally, because if you're going to be president, international opinion matters too. So please take our actions, all of you.
Agustin, also briefly, are there some specific roles that churches can or should play within this work in Florida?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, showing up during the legislative sessions is a big part. Even FIDP does those prayer vigils every time someone's executed, and that's a good time for the church to come together. That's what we do. We pray, right? So taking those actions and joining FADP in their campaign to end the death penalty by signing the petition is very, very important. Again, this for the church to be a central, part of their work. This is about life. And those who are listening to us now and those who are church leaders, lay leaders, please keep in mind, remember that if we don't do the work, if we don't get involved, people will die. That's my message, and that's our message.
Yeah, as Maria said, in our name. I know that FADP is on Facebook. So, and obviously you have a website with a lot of information there. I'll make sure to send that to everybody who's listening. Also, the petitions that you mentioned, we'll make sure to put that out as well. Let me say a bit about next month's webinar and what that will be, and then we'll head out and close out. But want to make sure to invite everyone to come next month. So on October 17th, our next individual that will engage is a woman named Hannah Bowman, and she also speaks about abolition, Maria, in very similar ways to you do. So she's the head of a group, though, called Christians for the Abolition of Prisons. And she believes that to be a Christian means that we as Christians should advocate for the end of prisons. And yes, you heard that right. And she's got a theology and a view and a means and a way to do that. So she's got a lot to share as we talk about all of this. And she certainly has the death penalty within that as well, the abolition or the end of the death penalty. So we'll talk with Hannah next month. She is a deep thinker about these things. And so that'll be it's Wednesday, October 18th at 2, but that's what the registration link says that I put there in the chat. Agustin and Maria, I'm grateful for your work. I respect it so much. I see the nuances and all the things happening in Florida and think about you all and pray for you all. I'm excited to see you all in person soon and want to direct people to you to support you. So thank you for your experiences, for what you shared. I know it is difficult and weighty. And Maria, blessings on you as you head back into court and Agustin back into your workday as well. But thank you, friends, for coming so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for listening.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for joining us. And we'll send an email and a recording out soon. Thank you all. Bye-bye.